The next panel was teed up really well by Senator Manchin. He asked, when are we going to start talking about the national debt approaching $20 trillion? And we weren't going to do it before he mentioned it, but asking you shall receive. In the last hour, we've pulled together a terrific panel to come up and speak on that very issue. So if I could call up to the stage Grover Nordquist, the President for Americans for Tax Reform, Mai McGuinness, President for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, and Richard Vague, Chairman of the Governors Woods Foundation, Founding Chairman and CEO of First USA Bank. All coordinated by our good friend Greg Ip, the Chief Economics Commentator for the Wall Street Journal. So a big round of applause for our next panel.
Thanks very much, and thank you in absentia to Senator Manchin, who, did exactly raise the right sort of like agenda-setting question. What are we going to do about this $20 trillion of debt? And just to put a few numbers in context, we economists like to compare something to a benchmark, and so as a share of GDP, the relevant figure is that the publicly held debt is 77% of GDP, which is the highest since the 1950s. But is that the figure to focus on, or should we be focusing on a couple of other figures, like our economic growth rate, which has only been around 2% since the recession ended, the weakest expansion in the post-war period, or the fact that inflation is below 2% despite the Federal Reserve's efforts to get it back to 2%, and even more striking that the government bond yield is around 2%, the lowest since the 1950s and the 1960s. In other words, you can look at that debt, as a lot of us do, and get very worried, or you could look at these economic figures and these bond yields and say that's, that's not the problem. It's the fact that there's not enough economic growth, and the markets certainly don't seem to be worried about debt. So I think in that context, as we embark on a pretty busy legislative year with tax reform and health care and regulatory reform and infrastructure spending all crowding the agenda, deciding what the priority needs to be between these two things is really going to be key. And we have a terrific panel here to talk about it. I think you've all heard their introduction, so I won't repeat that. But let me just begin this question with a bit of a scene setter. Last night, the Trump administration gave a briefing where they were asked about their plans for tax reform. And as you know, the plan is that they want to cut some tax rates, maybe do a few other things on the tax side, and in the process, stimulate economic growth. And I'll quote what the person briefing the reporter said. He said, "We want to make it revenue neutral. Our greater priority is to provide growth." So this didn't really clarify matters. And so what I'd like to ask the panelists, starting with you, Maya, can we have both? Can we have a tax reform that's revenue neutral, and can we also stimulate economic growth? Or are there tougher trade-offs here that the administration has yet to grapple with?
Well, there are certainly tougher trade-offs that the administration has yet to grapple with, and that is true throughout their fiscal agenda. But on the first question about growth and revenue neutral, actually the best way to grow the economy is tax reform that is revenue neutral, not deficit enhancing. So you put out, I thought, a really good starting point, which is there's so many numbers that tell the picture of the fiscal and economic health of the country. And I would add one more to the debt picture that you were looking, which is where we are in the debt today, which is near record levels, but also where are we headed? Because the last time our debt was this high as a share of the economy, we were coming out of World War II, and the debt projections and trajectory was to come down dramatically as we came out of the war. This time, the projection is the debt will keep on growing relative to the economy, in fact, faster than the economy every year, forever. But what we've seen from looking at past policies and sort of the economic case for tax reform is that paid-for tax reform does much more to promote sustained growth, which is what matters, not just a couple of years, but sustained growth, because you then don't have the increase in the debt, which undercuts some of the growth effects of tax reform. So given that the argument for tax reform, in addition to simplicity and fairness, is growth, you want to pay for your tax reform. I would recommend the administration offset the cost of tax reform fully through base broadening and other measures, and use all the growth that does happen, and I believe there will be some if it's done right, to help bring that down the debt, and that will be a self-improving cycle as a result. But I would just say the administration has made a lot of different points about what they're doing in terms of tax reform. It's like every time you hear the explanation, it's kind of a different story. So you get a bit of whiplash trying to figure out what their plan is on this. In the budget, they assume it would be completely revenue neutral. But then when they talk about tax reform, they assume the growth from reform would offset a big chunk of the cost. Those are very important differences.
Grover, what do you think? Maya just said that she thinks that the best growth effects come from tax reform that's fully paid for. Do you agree?
No, the best growth effects come from pro-growth policies, which are, for starters, the president's effort to go towards a 15% corporate rate. 15 or 20, I think, is what they're likely to end up at. And not only for companies, but for Subchapter S pass-throughs, partnerships, and so on, which is the big change in this administration's tax reform as opposed to Reagan's or some of the earlier ones, recognizing a lot of activity, economic activity in the United States takes place within the personal income tax, even though somebody runs a business, but they pay it through their personal income taxes, bringing that down to 15 or 20, and the House wants to cut the corporate rate 43% and the individual rate 43%. What Trump wants to do is take them both to 15, which is more dynamic. This is exactly the way to go. The other one is to go to full business expensing, which is in the House plan. The administration's not opposed to it, but it isn't yet in their formal plan. That's one that even Democrats over the years have been supportive of. Obama moved in that direction with a partial full expensing proposal for smaller companies. Not having long depreciation schedules drops the cost of capital and new investment rather dramatically, getting rid of the alternative minimum tax, getting rid of the death tax, which is a third or fourth bite at the apple after people have already paid taxes on the same dollar several times. And again, just some of the numbers that CBO says if you grow at 4% a year, Reagan's growth rates, as opposed to 2% a year, Obama's growth rates, you end up with $3 trillion more in revenue over per growth. So it's $6 trillion over a decade, $3 trillion if you grow at 3% rather than 2%, $6 trillion if you grow at 4% rather than 2%. We have heard arguments. We heard them after the Carter administration. Limits to growth. Remember, there wasn't any more growth. We knew in 1980, I was taught in business school, no more growth, not happening anymore. The guys in Rome, Club of Rome, had just decided that growth was not possible, couldn't happen. It wasn't that Carter had failed economic policies. It was that nobody could ever do growth. And now you hear the same thing from the outgoing Obama administration. We didn't fail. 2% was not failing. 2% is as good as you can get. We used to grow faster during the beginning of the Obama administration than Europe. Now, over the last year, 2016, we've been growing slower than Europe. So there's not some European, Swedish growth rate, French growth rate that we're all going to. We've fallen below the European growth rates, and they're actually growing faster than we are. So growth can happen, and it can happen with sound economic policies. I know we're talking tax reform here, but there's $1.8 trillion of deadweight cost on the economy every year from regulations. And you should like getting rid of regulations because there's no deficit or debt that occurs when you deregulate trucking or airlines or all the transportation, as we did under Carter and Reagan, bipartisan effort there, and as we can do with the permitting processes. I mean, the number of jobs that are waiting on a permit in this country, last number I saw from the chamber was 1 million jobs waiting on a permit, because Obama had a 8-year war on infrastructure where they weren't granting permits for pipelines and other infrastructure, particularly in energy. Let's allow the permits to happen. Let's allow the pipelines to be built. We need pipelines to the various areas where we now know there is energy that wasn't necessarily there in economically significant quantities before. So 1.8 trillion annual cost of regulations, we can take that down and you get a great deal of growth. But again, going to 4% growth gives you $6 trillion a decade of either paying down debt or further paying for tax cuts. And moving in that direction, I think, is extremely helpful and a good idea.
Do you think 4% growth is a reasonable benchmark for what we can achieve with tax reform and these other things?
We've done it, and we did it with tax cuts that were less aggressive under Reagan than taking the corporate rate down to 15%. I mean, I talked to Swiss bankers who said, you guys go to 15, people will be leaving Switzerland and moving to the United States. I met with the Treasury guys in Australia who said, we're at 30, you guys are at 35. You go to 15, we can't compete. We're going to have to get down too.
But the growth constraints aren't about tax reform. I mean, tax reform is definitely something that can help grow the economy, hopefully by a couple tenths of a percentage of GDP. That's sort of the higher end of the estimate. And one of the ways to make it more pro-growth is also get rid of some of the $1.6 trillion in tax breaks that we have per year by broadening the base. So on top of doing what you're talking about with rate reduction, you're offsetting those costs by getting rid of a lot of tax breaks that can de-equalize a lot of decisions. And that also keeps it from growing the debt, which is negative on growth. But the constraint isn't how much tax reform can or can't do. It's that the baby boomers are moving into retirement. This is a demographic challenge that we have not faced before. And what you can't do, I mean, you talk about how much we could get from 4% growth. We could get even more from 5% or 6%. But you can't keep dropping in these numbers because we want the growth. We need a plan to grow the economy. Regulation's part of it, tax reform's part of it, infrastructure, immigration, trade, a lot of things, bringing the debt down. Those will all help growth. But we have a real constraint on the labor market side with the demographic, the aging of the country, and we can't wave our hands and pretend the economy will grow more than the numbers imply they could.
Okay,
Well, that'd be a stronger argument, except we have a lot of people between 25 and 55 who have left the labor market over the last 10 years. We have a low labor participation rate, and you could significantly increase the number of people working without, and I'm very pro-immigration, but without any immigration, you could increase the labor market by getting people back into the labor market who between 25 and 55, they're not aging out, they got tired of not having a job, got out.
I want to bring Richard into this conversation. Richard, you've just written a book called The Next Economic Disaster, which is all about, what brings on crises and how do we prevent them. A lot of the debate around whether we should be prioritizing the debt is exactly about whether it is reaching, levels that are going to bring on a financial crisis. Do you think that ought to be like front and center in terms of what the federal government and what the Trump administration thinks about prevention of crises, controlling the debt? Tax reform comes later?
Government debt, we've studied this exhaustively, and for developed countries, government debt increases never bring crisis. It's private debt increases that bring crisis, whether it was the '86 crisis or the '07 crisis or what have you. Really want to comment on tax cuts for a minute. And by the way, every one of my friends is rabidly in favor of tax cuts, irrespective of how they feel about Trump. But I'd be cautious on unfunded tax cuts. I think it's possible to overestimate the benefit of tax cuts. Let's take the Reagan boom. From 1981 to 1985, the economy grew by $1 trillion. During that period, private debt grew by $1.5 trillion. Government debt grew by $1 trillion. So you had $2.5 trillion growth in debt to fund $1 trillion growth in GDP. That's really where this 4% growth comes from. Tax cuts were a very small part of that equation. They were about $100 billion, so that number's relatively dwarfed in the grand scheme of things. And by the way, the private debt boom under Reagan brought us the junk bond crisis, the S&L crisis, the oil patch crisis. For better or for worse, it's private debt trends that bring crisis and are determinant in economic outcomes, much, much more than government debt.
So I think one of the key issues about whether tax reform, whether you can cut tax rates and not pay for it, is the issue of how much tax cuts will generate growth and then pay for itself. If you're not steeped in the lovely arcana of Washington, this is called dynamic scoring as opposed to static scoring. With static scoring, you assume the economy doesn't respond. That's how you decide how much revenue is lost. With dynamic scoring, you say, hey, the economy responds. That gives you back some revenue. In your opinion, Maya, how much extra revenue can the administration count on from the dynamic scoring process? And what would be a wise way to approach this for the administration, which, as you've seen, is somewhat skeptical of the analysis of the Congressional Budget Office and some of the other nonpartisan scorekeepers that we have?
Well, being skeptical aside, the wise way, and I think the only way that they should, is to depend on the models that are put out by the Joint Tax and others that will score what the proposal is like to generate in terms of growth. I think given what we've seen before, looking at Dave Camp's tax plan and others, one of the things you find is that if a tax plan is debt finance, they may find the growth effects are negative. That's happened before. When there's too much debt involved, it actually has a negative effect. On the high end, probably recouping 20 to 25 cents on the dollar is the highest that you could affect from tax reform. I think that's what the model would say, and I assume it would be significantly lower depending on how much is debt financed and the specifics of the tax reform.
Well, CBO scored the Camp modeled dynamically as well as statically.
I'm talking about the dynamic. Some of the dynamic models
Right.
that
No,
have
but-
been scored have shown negative effects.
The CBO score for camp was $800 billion over a decade, about $1 trillion
Six different
increase.
scores, right? So that's the highest. They had a range of
So
6 scores.
That was the dynamic score. There's also
No, they had
static scores.
They had 6 dynamic scores.
Okay. Again, why would you limit yourself to guys who've been, I mean, I love the CBO guys. They've been consistently wrong. And you can go to the most recent tax cut we had to answer this question, which was the Bush second tax cut, 2003. And CBO scored that if you cut the capital gains tax and the dividend tax, that you would lose revenue. In point of fact, it gained revenue. And at the end of the 4 years, they got more revenue from in the economy than they were planning without the tax cut. So the tax cut, the most recent tax cut we had, which was targeted at particularly dynamic decision-making, capital gains and dividends, raised more money than it cost, and CBO was wrong in their static models. I'm all willing to listen to them, but they need to come back and explain how they've changed their model, given that they were wrong in the direction, not even in the numbers, but in the direction on their scoring of the most recent tax cut we've had.
Richard.
There has not, we've studied 47 countries in the entire period since World War II. Those 47 countries represent 92% of world GDP. There has not been a single instance where a government debt increase has paid for itself. There's 3 ways that government debt comes down as a percent of GDP. Rapid increases, offsetting increases in private debt, very large net export positions, and for smaller countries, inflation. There is no such thing as government debt increases paying for itself.
That's awfully discouraging. So our choices
There's no
basically
free
are
lunch.
like private debt crisis, inflation, and there was a third one there, but I don't think.
Net exports.
And that,
So like a Germany or a China in the early 2000s.
Well, we grew away from our World War II debt. We grew away from our Civil War debt. We grew away from our
In
World
both
War
of
I
those
debt.
instances, over dollar for dollar increase in private debt offset that.
but there is actually an interesting issue here, which is about whether the debt crisis is the sort of the dog that keeps that doesn't bark. Because Maya, you've been around a long time, as long as we've all been listening to these conversations for a long time, warnings about debt
I
crisis.
know, and yet so young.
Yes, well, I think you said debt crisis. before
Dynamic
you-
scoring here is a fact.
Thank you.
You're asking for dynamic score before you're asking for solid food. That's like as was I. So the point is we haven't had it, right? In fact, here we are, as I was saying at the outset, with the highest debt to GDP ratio in post-war history, and a bond yield at 2%. And I love the CBO as much as the next guy, but one of the reasons their dynamic models don't give tax cuts much credit is precisely because they think it'll crowd out private investment by pushing up interest rates. It's hard to look at the rise in government debt we've seen around the world and what's happened to interest rates and believe that that mechanism is still operative today. So what's your response
Yeah,
to that?
I mean, so there are a lot of different pieces about why one worries about debt. And the first is that the debt isn't a problem until it is. And once it is, you have a really hard time catching up with that. If it does push up interest rates, that causes your debt load to be higher, your debt payments higher, and you get in a vicious cycle. And we do have the situation right now where the fastest growing part of the budget is interest payments on the debt. Whether you want to be cutting taxes, whether you want to be increasing spending, putting more and more money into interest payments isn't a great use of it. But there are many other reasons that one worries about the debt as well. And I think one that's really relevant right now is that to have a healthy fiscal balance sheet whenever you enter a recession is critically important. When we entered the downturn of 2008, our debt was 38% of GDP. And we were able to borrow, and people will disagree whether the stimulus worked or it didn't, but I sure wouldn't want to be in a situation where it wasn't easy to borrow whatever we felt was necessary at the next economic crisis. And given the length of most crises, we are probably closer to the next one than the last one. And so I worry that that fiscal health is really defense. It's a protective measure so that you have the ability to respond to opportunities, to crises, to all sorts of things, which now that our debt is twice of what it was when we went into 2008, I don't think we're in a good position for that. And I also just think, just a side point is, in this whole conversation about growth, growing the economy really is one of the single most agenda items we have right now. And while we can disagree on the details, there's pretty broad-based agreement on what those things to do would grow the economy. In many ways, it's a political challenge more than it is an economic challenge. I think we could map out a pretty sensible, comprehensive economic growth plan, and a lower debt makes a lot more sense than a higher debt as part of that, because what we don't see about the effect of debt is it can bring down our standard of living, it can bring down our wage growth, so you don't know what you're missing, but we would be wealthier already today if we didn't have such a high debt and had been running a deficit for so long. That doesn't get people exercised and upset about it and talking about it at the kitchen table, but it takes a real hit on our standard of living.
Yes, Grover.
Yeah. When we want to reduce taxes, when there's an argument by the Republicans, it used to be Kennedy, but now John F. Kennedy, now the modern Republican Party, then all of a sudden deficits and debts become important. When the government's spending money, when I was in college, all my left of center professors explained deficit spending, that's just a word conservatives use to stop us from spending all the money that we ought to be spending because we're smarter than people are and we can spend their money smarter than they can. And so deficits were fine as long as it was deficit spending. The Democrats decided they didn't like deficits when Reagan offered tax cuts. Two thoughts. One is all of the buildup in debt you're talking about flowed from a time when the government was not cutting taxes. They were, in fact, Obamacare is $1 trillion of taxes over a decade, 20 different taxes, totaling $1 trillion, many of them hitting people who earn less than $250,000, despite certain promises we were made. And during that period, all this debt came up because there was massive spending, including the stimulus. I don't know how you can argue that the least successful recovery since World War II was helped by the stimulus. It seems to me, if you want a correlation of what they did and how badly it happened, the answer is spending all that money doesn't create growth. Keynes was wrong. And the idea that somehow if you borrow a dollar, it's not available in the market, but if you steal it, it is. The point is, total government spending is the deadweight cost of government. If we want $100, if the government, not we, the government wants $100, and they take 90 by force, and they borrow 10, they now have 100, and the real economy is short $100. It's not there. If they say, no, no, we don't want to crowd out private investment. Instead of taking 90 and borrowing 10, we'll send the guys from the IRS out, we'll take all 100. And then there'll be all this private sector money. I'm sorry, the government spends the money, it's not available in the real economy, it's now in the government economy. Whether you borrow it or tax it, it's gone. And so the argument that somehow taking it is better than borrowing it, I'm in favor of spending less. But the other distinction and arguing you've done something good by taking it instead of borrowing it, I miss that.
I think that the distinction is between whether you take it from the people who are enjoying the benefits of the tax cut today or from their children. I mean, it's taking one way or the other, right? Debt is just deferred taxes, isn't it?
Spending is all spending is the debt. The spending that you did is the deadweight cost. How you financing it is another question. My argument is the deadweight cost is what you want to reduce. We need to have economic growth, and we need to reform the entitlement systems because they're structured to make us go bankrupt. We have done that under Clinton with the block granting of aid to families with dependent children, now TANF. They're now looking at doing that with Medicaid, as well as down the road food stamps and the other means-tested programs. We should do something along those lines, the bipartisan plan that was originally put out on Medicare. Now, maybe we're not bipartisan enough anymore to take a bipartisan plan and do it under Trump, but that was once a bipartisan Brookings sort of proposal. So I think it still makes sense.
I certainly agree with one thing, which is fiscal responsibility is so often just defense for whichever political party is out of power. But it's not just Democrats who do it, it's Republicans who do it. So Democrats find the gospel of fiscal responsibility when we're talking about Republicans in power who want to cut taxes, and Republicans find it when Democrats are in power and want to increase spending. And the very, very small overlap is people who actually worry about the economic effects regardless of the political agenda or think that it's more economic than it is political defense. But I think, Grover, that when you talk about what grows the economy and what doesn't, you do too much of correlating and saying it's causality. Like, just because there's a tax cut at one moment, the economy's growing or not, doesn't show what happened. The business cycle is really important, where we are in the business cycle. And I just don't think that there is any case to be made that tax cuts routinely spur sustained growth. There's so many examples of that not being true, but it isn't just that this happened in this year and this didn't. I do think one of the biggest problems in the growth agenda is how we spend our money and how we tax. You're talking about deadweight loss, and there's definitely efficiencies you can get on both sides. So much of what we borrow for is not for investment. If it were, it would be a much different situation. But so much of what we borrow for is consumption, the biggest portion being entitlements. And so much of how we tax is taxing on the things we want more of, not the things we want less of. So one thing is to how you shift, how you spend, and how you tax, even before you think about how much you do of each.
So let's shift the conversation a bit away from taxes to the spending side. So one issue on which there actually seems to be some bipartisan agreement now is we should spend more on infrastructure. This week, President Trump came out with the outlines of a plan to spend up to $200 billion over the coming decade on infrastructure. The last administration also argued that infrastructure was an appropriate type of spending that could be financed by borrowing more because it added to the economy's debt servicing capacity. Richard, let's start with you. Are there forms of spending like infrastructure that are entirely appropriate to run the debt up for? Would you do that if you were making the decision?
Well, it's a tough choice, but our infrastructure deficit right now is estimated by the ASCE to be in the $4 to $5 trillion range. You have most of that, by the way, is roads, bridges, and water systems, which in many cases are crumbling. So you need to spend the money. Where it comes from is the problem. 75% of all education and infrastructure spending happens at the cities and state level. They have no money. There's no capacity at the city and state level. They have the opposite situation. So I think some measured form of productive, targeted infrastructure spending that's not just everybody's pet project, that really is the things that do need to be done, is in order.
Is it okay to borrow to do that?
I think in the context, yes. And let me just say one more time. I think what Grover does and what MAI does is extremely important. We need all that we can muster in keeping tax rates low and keeping the deficit low. But the truth remains, government debt has, in the post-war period, never caused a crisis in a developed country. It's runaway private debt that caused the crises that we've experienced all over the war. The reason the United States is experiencing suboptimal growth right now is because we're burdened at the business and personal level with way too much personal and business debt. In 1950, private debt to GDP was 50%. Today it's 150%. It dwarfs government debt. It is central to understanding why we have lackluster performance today.
But how much private debt is driven by tax policy, where a company borrows money, the interest on a bond the interest is tax-free, but if you raise it in the market through stocks, it's not? Fannie and Freddie drove a lot of private.
Tax policy on debt, which makes debt deductible, is an influencer. But if we look at this over 200 years under enormously divergent tax regimes in different countries, the story is always the same. There's always an upward trend and accumulation of private debt. So I think ultimately it's not that big of a factor.
On infrastructure, if you were to rebuild all the water pipes, both sewage and clean water, drinking water in the country, it's about $1.3 trillion. There are laws that were passed over the last years in many cities and states that require, they say, if you're going to have pipes in our city, they have to be made of this material and they have to be this big. Other cities have open competition. They say, well, we'll tell you what we need, how strong it has to be. We won't tell you what to make it out of. We won't tell you what company to buy it from. And we don't tell you what industry is going to make profit off of it. And we have invented plastic since these laws were invented. And when you look at cities that have been open competition and compare them with ones that are closed competition, to redo fit the whole country, the 1.3 trillion, you save about $380 billion by moving to open competition. So why would anybody consider spending a penny of federal money on infrastructure, on pipelines, when cities and states have passed laws, maybe because they had a bad one and they wanted to make sure it didn't happen again, and with the best available technology, they put the limit in. Or maybe because the guys who made pipes out of steel from certain places got the laws written for themselves. Either way, laws which drive up the cost by 28% of fixing water pipes need to be repealed at the state and local level before anybody should ask the federal government for money. The Davis-Bacon Act, which was passed in the 1930s to keep African Americans out of jobs in New York, because they didn't want these Southern blacks coming up and taking white union jobs in the Northeast. And if you read the debates they had on the floor of the Senate, it was pretty disgusting. That law exists today. And that law drives up the cost of building anything with federal money. Pipelines, not pipelines, but pipes for water. If the feds are paying for it, you have Davis-Bacon apply. It requires prevailing wage, which is something the South Africans used as well, in order to keep out new entrants to the workforce. That's a 25, some people say more, but at least 25% cost increase for every bridge, every road, because of a federal law. Why in the world would you enter into a bit? We have to have roads. We could have 25% more roads, 30% more roads. You got rid of Davis-Bacon. There are also rules, and I'm trying to get my hands on this now, but the people who build roads tell me they have laws similar to the roads that the pipeline people have, where somebody came up with the best road has to have this much gravel. Well, does it still? I don't know. But open competition, you say, you tell me what you need for a road and let everybody compete. Don't have these corporate welfare laws that were designed to advantage Fred over Mary, or different ethnic groups in the country. There's a bunch of reform that has to be done, and there's no reason not to do it. Why pay more for infrastructure, billions more for infrastructure than necessary? That needs to be cleaned up.
Okay, we have about 13 minutes left, and I'd like to have some of you come into the conversation here. Steve Clemens is there with a microphone, so if you have a question
questions, wink at me or something. I'm going to open here, so we're going to go to Jed here in a second. But let me just ask you, one of the reasons I love this economic summit is because it's the closest I can imagine in medieval days to getting to a convening of alchemists, which really kind of excites me, right? So I'm just interested because it's so I mean, everyone has a story in which we, potentially look at growth. We, find different formulations. How do you tweak the beast to get it? I'm just interested because I see in here real differences between the three of you. If you could control one lever that you thought got us and the economy to a better place, what is the one single lever that you would answer? Just one sentence. Maya, Grover, Richard.
A comprehensive debt deal that has trade, immigration, tax reform,
Oh,
regulatory
cheater.
reform, and reducing the debt.
You just put 6 levers on your dashboard there,
Yeah,
Steve.
yeah.
We need to stop compartmentalizing, and we need to do things more in a more integrated way when it comes to the economy. So I really think focusing on how these things work together,
Right.
not in their political buckets or not in their territorial congressional committee buckets.
Grover?
Comprehensive growth.
There isn't one, but for political reasons, it's easier to cut marginal tax rates than it is to rethink regulations, because there's so many different buckets it's in. So if you wanted me to pick one, I pick the one that you can look at, focus on, and deal with.
Door
But
A,
the other
door
is,
B.
The other is every bit as important. And if you look at Trump's picks for FCC, FDA, FERC, NLRB, there is a wave of deregulation that has begun and will continue, that will be every bit as important to the economy as our tax cut.
And Richard?
The area of opportunity in the United States right now that is profound is medical research. If we just double the NIH, we have a chance within the next 10 to 15 years to cure cancer, Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, and diabetes. That's 1.5 million deaths a year. You do several things if you do that, not the least of which is a jobs revolution. That's the first thing I'd do.
Cool. Interesting. Jed Schilling.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, he's introduced me, so I don't have to introduce myself, but a couple of points that lead to questions. One, on the regulations, I think it's important to take account, as Maya just indicated, much more than just the economic impacts, because a lot of them are protecting social values and benefits, like regulations to reduce pollution emissions and things like that. And if there are taxes or other things on factors that contribute to that, that's a way not just of taxing, but of paying for the cost imposed on the rest of society, because GDP does not take account of many of these negative benefits, and looking only at GDP, you miss a lot of the social benefits and welfare and things like the benefits of education. So you need to take this much broader view when you're looking at regulations and taxes and things like that. The second point, in terms of the private debt being the major cause of the economic crises, I think that's an important point, but you need to think beyond that, because particularly for the 2008 crisis, 2007-2008 crisis, you had what I call paper assets, the vast increase in derivatives and other things that the financial sector and related sectors create to generate paper wealth, income that they have on spending, but creates a huge bubble that was even bigger than the debt, because derivatives amount to between $4 and $6 trillion, and they don't represent any real value.
Yeah, do you have a question?
So can you comment on that? I just wanted to make the point
Okay,
that you need to take account of this in looking at debt, because it's as bigger a cause of problems than the debt.
Richard, I'll have you touch on the debt question, and Grover, why don't you answer the question about benefits to regulation?
No, the derivative markets, are, the word derivative implies that they are derived by the underlying debt. So I think it's really the same measurement. And we've studied that fairly rigorously over multiple economies, over a couple of hundred years. And the primary measure of when you're going to have a crisis is about 20% growth in private debt to GDP in about a 5-year period. If you have that, you have about an 85 to 90% chance of having a crisis. That's with or without the presence of derivatives. So derivatives really all existed to help facilitate the high mortgage growth during that period.
Grover,
Yeah, I think we should look at the costs and the benefits of regulations, and I don't think the government does a very good job of even understanding the costs. One of the most important deregulation movements in the United States today is called the Right to Try movement. More than 30 states have passed laws saying that even though the FDA has decided that a drug is safe, but they're going to take them another 5 years to decide if it's effective, people who are dying of terminal diseases should be able to, in those states, I think it's 35 states now, Hogan in Maryland was the last state to sign on, because when we should be calculating when the FDA delays a drug and they announce a drug, oh, this drug is great, it's going to save 1,000 people a year. And the last 10 years while we waited for you, how many people died? So the FDA, the states are now challenging the FDA and saying, like medical marijuana, I know you guys have a federal law, we don't care. In our state, we say it's legal. They're doing the same with life-saving drugs, and that is making the FDA begin to reform its behavior in how they allow drugs, compassionate use out for people whose life.
So we're just at the end. So let's do some lightning round questions, lightning round answers. So you have a short question, right?
Thanks for your presentation. My name is Li Yang. Then we discussed